Hey guys, you're listening to Wingin' It with Holly. In this podcast series, I'll be sharing the fun and interesting things I've learned about birds since I started really noticing them 5 years ago. I'm no expert though, so along the way I'll be picking the brains of my knowledgeable birdie friends, the human ones that is, so we can learn and wing it together. You can see birds anywhere, in a city or the countryside, watching from a balcony or your local park. And I'm hoping these short episodes will help you notice and learn more about our feathered friends, especially if you've never taken the time to get to know them before. Red kites are one of our most striking and widespread birds of prey. But did you know they almost went extinct in the UK a few decades ago, and we wouldn't be seeing them now if it wasn't for a reintroduction programme that took place in the 80s. So in this episode, I chat to my Auntie Karen, who was involved in this work to bring them back from the brink. So, today I am at RSPB Pulborough Nature Reserve with my Auntie Karen, who I want to talk to you today, Karen, about red kites, because red kites are one of our most, I think, distinguishable and beautiful birds of prey that we get here in the UK. Their wings are kind of quite angular, and the key thing is that their tails are forked, and there aren't really any other birds of prey in the UK that have that forked tail. So that's like the key thing to look out for. They're very, very, very clearly very special birds. But many people don't know that they have, in I think what was the 19th and also into the 20th century, they almost were at the point of extinction. So correct me if I'm wrong. But yeah, they were persecuted by humans. Almost to the point of extinction in the UK, with the exception of a small group that remained in Wales. And I understand that in the late 80s, two conservation organisations set up a reintroduction program to help reintroduce and re-establish the presence of these wonderful birds, which, you know, they wouldn't have almost disappeared in the first place if it wasn't for humans. So it was a sort of intervention that was necessary because, they shouldn't have been going. It wasn't a natural thing that they were almost going extinct. You're the perfect person to talk to about this because you were there at the time and you were working with one of these organisations that introduced this program, and so you were there when this was all happening. So yeah, I want to start there, if that's okay, with your career in, well, I think it was wildlife crime. So you were kind of like a police officer for wildlife. Is that fair to say?
You could say I specialised on wildlife law. Yes, for 10 years I worked investigating wildlife crime, and we obviously concentrated on the rarer birds of prey, and the types of persecution we were seeing was illegal shooting, illegal poisoning, illegal taxidermy, people collecting their eggs. Egg collecting was still a big thing back in the 1980s. It's hard to believe now, I know. The red kite was a bird that was actually extinct in England and Scotland, and there was a tiny population left in Wales, and that was it.
Which is kind of insane to think, because I mean I feel in a way very lucky to say that I've never known that extent of extinction, if that makes sense. What I mean is I've always seen lots of red kites around, but that wasn't always the case. So before we go any further, let's talk about red kites, and so that people know exactly what we're talking about. They're a bird of prey.
Yes.
They behave quite like buzzards. Yep. Do you mind elaborating a little bit on what I mean by that?
In that they are opportunistic feeders. They will eat just about anything. So they're not fussy. They fly around, they look for things that they could possibly catch, small animals. They're not going to take anything big, rabbits, maybe rodents, but largely what they're looking for are things that are already dead. They're looking for carrion, not necessarily meaty things. They'll frogs, anything that they can pick up and eat. They also spend a lot of time on the ground eating worms, beetles and insects. So this is a bird which by its very nature should be very successful. Throughout Europe it is very successful, it's everywhere. And when in medieval times in this country, they were everywhere. There are stories about them picking up rubbish left in the streets of London. So they were obviously living in cities alongside people. And even in massive cities like Delhi in India, there is a type of kite very closely related to the red kite, the black kite, and they do live on rubbish heaps in these massive metropolitan cities. So this is a bird that should be very successful, but there was at one time it was a protected bird. Even back in the sort of just before the 16th century, it was a protected bird. But then after in about the early 1600s, they put a bounty on it for some reason. They believed that they were responsible for actually hunting people's livestock, so they put a bounty on it, and everybody went out killing them. And that slaughter, that unregulated slaughter of these birds, the killing of the birds, the destroying of their nests, the taking of their eggs, that went on right up until the early part of the 20th century. So that by about the early part of the 1900s, they were extinct in England, extinct in Scotland, and they existed only, a small population existed in mid Wales, and that was it. And they'd gone from everywhere else. And that is extraordinary for what is a relatively short period of time, for that bird to have been totally wiped out throughout most of the UK. And back in the 1980s, when I was involved in conservation, I was actually part of a group of people who used to go to mid Wales, and we would actually guard nests. Then we would sit under trees with electronic equipment, trying to make sure that egg collectors and people who wanted to kill them wouldn't actually disturb the birds, take their eggs, and hurt the birds at all. There were even occasions when the army would actually get involved. They would set up an operation where people would have to be covertly, living in the forest for maybe a couple of weeks. So it would tie in with a little bit of nest watching. And there were occasions when the army would be guarding the nests of particularly rare birds, including red kites, which seems crazy now.
It does, but and also so going back to the bounty that started all of this. Just to be clear, like what were the main reasons people put it? Because it was killing things that they didn't want it to kill, maybe? What was it? Why did they have such a big problem with the red kites?
The argument was that the red kites were responsible for killing and taking livestock. So presumably sheep, goats.
But does that make any sense when they're not? How could they possibly be big enough to do something like that?
Yeah, I mean, they were falsely accused from the very beginning, because they don't. They might walk amongst sheep in a farmer's field, but what they're actually looking for is insects and rabbits. They don't kill sheep. But of course it's like, they wanted to blame these birds. They've done it for years. And certain wildlife, it's like, in certain other countries where they blame wolves for killing, a whole herd of cattle or something. It's so outrageous that it's ridiculous. But people it's very hard to change their attitude towards them. Once you demonize a wild animal or a wild bird, then people just carry on demonizing.
It sounds a little bit like this demonization of herring gulls, and like people are saying that they can pick up and take away little dogs and things when they don't even have like the claws to do that, let alone the inclination. So but they are completely demonized, aren't they, gulls? So I assume it's it sounds to me like it was just the most ridiculous story, but the consequence is they actually almost went extinct. That is just insane.
It's almost like, and once you introduce a bounty, once you start paying people,
when money's involved,
absolutely, you're going to go out and people are going to kill as many as they possibly can. in order to pick up the bounty. And when you're talking about poor people, you know, picking up a bounty for every single one they hand in. You know, once in every country where they've introduced bounties for killing things, wolves were always a prime example, coyotes in North America, bears in some places. Once you introduce a bounty system, then there is uncontrolled killing, uncontrolled slaughter, and there's you know, things will diminish at an alarming rate. And this was what happened to red kites.
So we're talking like, you know, as late as the 70s, they, I guess, weren't even around in the UK at all. Were they actually extinct? Were they completely gone?
Yes, yeah, they were.
Sorry, in England.
In
not
England?
Obviously not Wales, but in
No,
England,
right.
Scotland,
And Ireland.
Northern Ireland.
And Ireland. Yeah, they were locally extinct, which meant there were no breeding pairs there. And they when they started to do some research into the birds that were left in Wales, they realised that that genetically they were so closely related that it was unlikely that they were ever going to be able to create a viable population, even if they stopped all the persecution. The population in Wales was so small, so genetically undiverse, that chances are they were never ever going to be enough to allow them to spread. They were never going to spread into England naturally, ever.
Right. So, talk to me then about this reintroduction program and literally the what it physically took to get these birds back breeding again in the UK.
Well, it was in the 1990s, late 80s, 90s, there were discussions being held with the government conservation groups, which was the NCC, the Nature Conservancy Council, which covered the whole of UK, and this is the government department, talking to conservationists about how best to try and increase the number of red kites in the country, because it was a bird that was missing, and it was a niche that was missing as well. And so the decision was made that they should introduce birds from another country, bring them into the UK and release them in several secret sites, because the sites that they chose had to be habitat that was really suitable for this bird.
And what do you mind? So, what kind of habitat is that? Do you remember?
It has to be parkland with good mature trees for them to nest in. The food had to be there, so it had to be lots of pasture land where they could find voles, farmland where they could go and find worms, where there was a healthy population of things like rabbits naturally that they could also feed on. So it really was about choosing their habitat wisely. And of course the Welsh conservationists had an awful lot of experience of conserving red kites. They knew the sort of thing that they needed. They just had to find other places in Scotland and in England and in Northern Ireland where they could actually bring these birds to. So it was a little bit like the white-tailed eagle reintroduction that was done in Scotland. They brought the birds from Spain, and what they did was they found healthy nests in Spain which had maybe up to 3 or 4 young. They would take one of the young and they would take it into captivity and they would rear it in the area where they were going to release it until such time as it would have naturally left the nest, and they would release them in that area. And it was working quite well, except they discovered an interesting thing they discovered about the Spanish birds is that they do move around an awful lot. So when they release these birds on these sites, their desire was to go elsewhere.
Back to, I think you were going to say go back to Spain.
Whether they did go back to Spain, but yeah, in effect, they migrate locally.
Right.
So of course, and for them, they would be migrating hundreds of miles. So what they found was that they didn't really stay around. Right. They left the area.
Oh dear, that's, yeah.
So what they did is they decided that they would bring birds from Sweden instead, because they were much more localised birds, and they didn't tend to migrate very far. So they brought those instead, and that's when it really, really started to become successful. That these birds, and they were tagged, they had these great big tags put on their wings so people could spot them. Some of them had telemetry sets on, which is like a little radio transmitter attached to their back, so that the conservationists, the researchers, lots of researchers involved in monitoring these birds at all of the sites, so that they could find out exactly where they were going to and keep an eye on them all the time. And what they found was that the birds were staying in these areas, and then they started to breed within the areas, and then as the population started to grow, they started to spread out. And I mean, it was really quite a phenomenal rate at which these birds were both breeding successfully and moving out of the original areas, and people were seeing them on the M4 on the side of the road. They were down in Berkshire. People were starting to see them in around Leeds, where there was a release site up there, and in Scotland they were really, really doing so well. And even though there have been incidents of persecution of these birds, some of them have succumbed to deliberate poisoning by some people. Some of them have been shot. Nevertheless, this bird has hung on and just gone back to doing what it does really well, which is being resourceful, actually finding its own food, being an opportunistic. And in the meantime, the population in Wales has actually done really well, because some of those birds have actually increased and gone over into Wales. And so the genetic diversity of the ones in Wales has improved because of these new birds coming in. And if you think about it, to have a bird going from extinct in England and Scotland and Ireland and Northern Ireland in the 1980s to what is basically 40 years later. We saw one today at Pulborough Brooks flying over with the buzzards, and it's just an absolutely wondrous thing, and it's amazing.
I think that says so much though about the fact that they were never meant to go missing in the first place. The fact that the reintroduction has been so successful that they are thriving, it kind of just, I think, speaks volumes about they were never meant to not be here. They were the fact that it just came so naturally, as in it sounds like it wasn't a reintroduction program that was kind of, touch and go. It was kind of, no, bam, they've got back on it. And do you know what I'm trying to say?
I do understand what you mean, and I think there are lots of people who would like to introduce lots of different animals and birds and bring them back into the country. These animals and birds that have disappeared over the years, over the centuries, and people want to bring them back. And the first fundamental question you have to ask is, why are they not there already?
Yes, are they not there for natural reasons, or are they not there for human reasons?
Absolutely. So if you can answer that question, if it is because people have interfered with them and basically exterminated them, but the habitat is still there, the food is still there, the opportunity for them to find nest sites, the opportunity for them to find each other is still there. That is what you have to look at. But you cannot bring back an animal if its habitat's gone. You can't bring back an animal or bird if actually they haven't been here in recent history. You can't really bring back something if it hasn't got its home anymore. And the thing about the red kite is that it was always a resourceful bird. It was always a bird that was able to change what it eats, change where it lives. Totally and utterly adaptable. I remember listening to a programme once, and there was, when I was working in Wales in the 80s, we would have to walk into oak woodland, because that's predominantly where these red kites were nesting. We would walk, for maybe half an hour into some remote part of an oak woodland on the side of a hill in Wales to sit and watch this nest. So these birds were incredibly secretive. They'd been forced into the most sort of secure places that they could find. And when they started nesting after the reintroduction, I can remember there being a radio program on the television, on the radio, a program, and it was interviewing a lady, and they said to her, "We understand you have some really exciting birds in your garden." She said, "Yes, I do. I have some red kites, and they nest in my garden." They said, "Where?" And they said, "In my Scots pine at the end of my garden." And they said, and she said, "Just describe your garden." She said, "Well, it's fairly normal. It's about 40 foot long and about 20 foot wide." And basically she had, and they said, "Where do you live?" She said, "On the edge of Reading." And it's almost like, I'd had to tromp into what you could have called wilderness to find this bird. And this lady had them nesting in a Scots pine tree in her Reading garden.
Right.
That is how resourceful this bird was, and how adaptable this bird was. I mean, it was a great candidate for reintroduction, really.
Right. And so you must remember a time then when you sort of didn't see these birds, or that coming across one would be just like the most magical thing because they're so rare, and then sort of now seeing them, like that feeling must just be just so exciting for you, because you've seen the before and the after. What a great story.
It is. It's a fantastic story, and I think it shows that when you collaborate with other organisations and you work together and you get the science backing it and you know exactly what you're doing, then it is possible to bring back some birds which have been lost to this country, that have never come back. And I think of things like, redback shrikes, which haven't really been seen since the 1970s. And that's a really sad bird. That's a bird that's never come back. And I can remember in Wales in the 1980s, driving along on my own along a valley, and I looked to my left and there was a red kite flying in the valley alongside my car, and I screeched to a halt and I jumped out my car and I got my binoculars and I watched it until it disappeared out of view down the end of the valley. And I remember looking around thinking, oh my goodness, I have no one to share this with, because it was like the moment was magical. And there was nobody there with me, and I just wanted to jump up and down and say, "I've just seen a red kite! I've just seen a red kite!" And now they fly over my house in East Yorkshire.
Right.
I always say, if you if you're driving along and you see a bird, and you are forced to screech to a halt and jump out and look at it and watch it for half an hour, it's got to be something really special. There aren't many birds that sort of do that for you in England anymore. But I mean, that was one of those moments that I just thought, this is so utterly magical. And it also made me think, if this bird is lost to this country, it would be an absolute tragedy. And I just think it's absolutely wonderful the way that now everybody gets that moment that I had on that Welsh road, because, and particularly people who understand the story of this bird, that there are so many people who can relive that experience that I had back in the 80s and just get so excited about just seeing it. What
an amazing success story. And I just want to say thank you for the work that you and these other organisations did to make this happen. And also, I also hope now that when people see red kites, they stop and think about, actually they weren't here like 40 years ago, and think about the work that's been done to bring them back, and the fact that actually it's actually very special that we see them, even if you see them regularly. I mean, you're very lucky, and you wouldn't be able to see them if it wasn't for the reintroduction program. So thank you so much for telling us about that, Karen. What a wonderful story, and thank you for all the work you did.
Thank you. You're welcome.
So hope to have you on again soon. Thank you, and until next time.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you for listening to this episode. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and if you have any birdie questions you'd like me to explore in this podcast, you can get in touch via my Instagram @WingingItWithHolly.